So welcome everyone far and near to our webinar conversation between Elizabeth Smith and Michael Berger about Michael's ideas-focused balanced textbooks and source books designed for courses on the history of Western civilization. I am Natalie Fingerhut, one of the acquisitions editors here at University of Toronto Press. Instructors of a Western civilization curriculum can nowadays choose from any number of textbooks, most of which are, in all honesty, perfectly good, wrote Orrin Falk from Cornell University about Michael's books. But I know of no other textbook in English that I would recommend to undergraduates, graduate students, and colleagues as a thought-provoking read on its own merits. Berger's books are for those instructors who believe that the goal of teaching history is not to impart knowledge, but to provoke their students to a certain way of thinking. It is a pleasure to introduce Michael Berger, professor of history at Auburn University at Montgomery, whom I've had the privilege of working with for the last 18 years or so as the editor on these books, and Elizabeth Smith, our publisher's representative at University of Toronto Press.
Thanks, Natalie, and good afternoon, everyone. I hope you're all doing well. We're very happy to offer this workshop and are fortunate to be joined by the author of the recently published third edition of the Shaping of Western Civilization textbooks and accompanying source books to help instructors with their course planning and offer strategies on how to best utilize these books to deepen student engagement with what are certainly complex but nonetheless stimulating ideas. I just want to take a moment to remind all of our participants that this session will be recorded and shared on our YouTube channel for future reference. And I want to encourage you all to participate in this discussion by sharing any of your comments or your questions for Michael in the chat box or alternatively our Q&A box. And we'll make sure to leave a few minutes at the end to discuss those. I'd also like to take a moment to acknowledge the land under which the University of Toronto Press operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island, and we're grateful for the opportunity to work on this land. With that said, it's my pleasure to introduce to you Professor Michael Berger. He teaches advanced courses in ancient, medieval, and early modern Europe at Auburn University at Montgomery. And he was named Mississippi Humanities Teacher of the Year when he taught in that state as well. Another little interesting thing about Michael is that he also once lived in what had been a 12th century chapel, something I'm sure all historians watching would have particular appreciation and fascination for. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here.
Great, we're happy to have you. So, Michael, I want to first lay the foundation for this discussion by asking if you could talk more broadly about some of the key turning points in history that you see as the most pivotal for the reader's understanding of Western civilization. Your textbooks cover quite an immense historical scope, and they're across 2 volumes. So you have volume 1 covering the Antiquity to the Reformation, and volume 2 from the Reformation to the present day. How did you decide which historical events or periods to emphasize? And can you speak to how you balance political, social, and cultural history in this narrative?
All right. Well, that's a tall order. Let me see what I can do here. Okay, first of all, what I did is what I think actually you do when you teach a course. I sat down and thought, okay, what do I want to say? I know that sounds obvious, right? But it really is hard because Western Civ is a huge thing. And if you try to talk about everything under the Western Civ sun, you wind up saying a tiny little bit about a whole lot, and it doesn't really come to very much, right? That's the least satisfying course. And I thought that's going to be the least kind of satisfying textbook. So instead, really, I thought, okay, the virtues of this book will be the virtues of, mutatis mutandis, of a monograph or a journal article. It has a point, right? It's got to be a big point, but it has a point. And it has to have a supporting evidence and argument for that that will engage students. And so, there are a number of turning points, but I would say the big themes, really, if you look at volume 1 of the textbook, the big theme is the fusion of various societies that ultimately, all of them add elements to what becomes a crisis in the Reformation. And that crisis in the Reformation ultimately brings about a kind of the beginnings of the collapse, I should say, of theocracy. And so one way to describe volume 1 is it's about the rise and decline of theocracy, but a rise and decline of theocracy powered by a series of cultural fusions going back to the ancient Near East, running through Rome and Greece and the Middle Ages. And so that's the kind of larger structure. Volume 2 is, I think you could argue, well, I will argue, volume 2, the big overarching thing is you start with a society which is defined or defines itself organically, and that sense is atomized by a series of changes running from the scientific revolution to the Enlightenment that the scientific revolution produced, to absolute monarchy and industrialization. And the result was, by the 19th century, a West that is trying to find a way to reconstitute a sense of community. Nationalism and Marxism are both manifestations of that. What we today call identity politics arguably are, but this is all fueled by those changes of the 17th and 18th centuries. And so you have a larger overarching structure for each volume. And then when it comes to the reader, the source reader, I picked sources that could work to provide students evidence with which to think about all those developments. Now, I will say the sources could be used for other purposes too, right? They're not just for that. But that really was my guide to choosing. And the other guide, I would say, thematic guide, was I did try to stress 2 genres in the source book: letters and biographies. Partly because students are engaged by them, partly because letters often are very short, and sometimes it's handy to have a really short source, but also because there are 2 genres that run through the readers, then students are able better to compare and contrast a letter from, say, ancient Rome and a letter from, say, Erasmus or something of that sort. And so having those genres laced through the source book, and certainly not everything is a letter or a biography, but having those sources laced through the source book better enables that kind of comparison and contrast work that what instructors often want students to do, and I certainly want students to do.
That's great. And actually, it kind of lends well into our next discussion point on your pedagogical approach. I just want to talk a little bit more about that, because anyone who's taught with your materials before knows that you have a unique and valuable approach to pedagogy. It's one that encourages students to engage in critical thinking about the history of ideas rather than just passively absorbing a timeline of events. Can you speak a little bit more about how your approach may differ from more traditional survey-style Western Civ textbooks that are on the market? And how does fostering an appreciation for this kind of historical interpretation help students to think more like historians?
Well, I think there are a few things. First of all, just most basically, again, what I try to do in the textbook is what I think instructors want to do in a course, which is you want to model for students, first of all, that one uses evidence to support arguments. And so rather than say, for example, that, I don't know, long distance trade in the late Roman Empire declined, right? Long distance trade in the late Roman Empire declined because we can look at the numbers of shipwrecks that have been recovered from the Mediterranean and find a real drop off in the 3rd and 4th centuries. And that means there's less shipping that was happening because there were fewer ships to sink. And I think students should get constant reminders that they should use evidence when making an argument, and that should and it's good to have that happen in a textbook as well as in a faculty lecture or in a discussion of a primary source. Right? I also will point out that I do stress ideas, but I don't want people to think that the book is this sort of Hegelian disembodied discussion of ideas that have nothing to do with concrete material stuff. And in fact, that example of shipwrecks would be an example of that, right? Those aren't ideas; those are just wrecks on the bottom of the Mediterranean. The other thing I try to do in the book is to give students some sense of historiography. This can't be done systematically throughout the books, because the 2 volumes, because otherwise you'd never get to the end, right? So you have to be strategic. And so, for example, I decided, all right, I'm going to make the debate between a sort of a Gibbon-esque Rome fell in the 5th century school on the one hand, and the debate between the late Antiquity school that says, no, we should really talk about all kinds of continuities that really bridge what used to be called the fall of Rome and what some still call the fall of Rome. I should build that debate into the book. And so a whole chapter really of volume 1 is organized basically around that. Right? It gives students just enough narrative to understand what's going on, but it's really organized around that larger issue of the late Antiquity school versus a more traditional, and I will say increasingly revived school of Roman history that really does think in terms of a fall and a collapse. And so that's, I think something students should get from a Western Civ course. But again, the instructor or the textbook writer, in my case, has to think strategically about where to place that kind of historiographical discussion, because he can't do it through the whole course or through a whole book.
Right, it's very vast. So there's some strategy in what to prioritize and how to best do it. And on that point, do you have any suggestions to help the reader understand the primary sources from your sourcebook volumes? I'm especially thinking about undergraduate students who may have never encountered a primary source before, depending on if Western Civ is offered at the 1st or 2nd year level. It might be intimidating kind of subject matter, especially to engage with the primary material. Is there anything you can suggest to instructors on how to integrate this in ways that foster better understanding for students?
I think certainly it helps at the beginning of the semester to, in class, walk students through by the hand through a source, right? And I know the problem here is always time, right? Devoting a whole class section to one thing can feel difficult for an instructor, because we don't have a lot of time to get to 1648 or whatever it is we're trying to do. But that's one move to make. I will say I have found it useful to, even before doing that, simply say to students, okay, you're going to read a source, a short source. In volume 1 of the Reader, I like the Descent of Ishtar for this purpose, right? Hint, hint. And actually have students write something where they explain what the source is, and then they use it to attack or support some assertion that I've made in class about ideas about the afterlife in Mesopotamia. And then after students have actually had to really work through it themselves by writing this short little 1-pager, then in class, walk through the source. It really works more effectively if the students really have engaged with the source even before class starts. And so having that little writing. And so, yeah, there's still a little intimidation factor, but the idea is to help them get over that hump for the later sources, which frankly will be often longer, and some of them will be a little harder. Now, there is also in the Reader a walkthrough of a little short source that an instructor can assign, right? So I have a little bill of sale for a house in Roman Egypt in the preface of the introduction to the Reader that actually walks students through, okay, how would we read this source? What can we conclude from it? How should you think about reading a primary source? There's that kind of thing. So an instructor can tell students to read that. I do that, but I still find the in-class exercise is helpful. And so I'd recommend it. And then I will say I've had as an optional reading for students, I don't require it. I did actually write a short little book called Reading History on how to read sources. And I have told students, look, if you're especially nervous about doing this, you could consult this book and read these chapters. And every semester I have a few students who go ahead and do that and tell me it was rewarding, it was helpful for them, right? But I'm not recommending students go out and buy another book.
Well, it's always something that instructors could maybe consider as supplementary reading, because that reading history book certainly does pair well with any other textbook that they may use, especially in this Western Civ class. So thanks for giving that a mention. Yeah, I just want to shift gears a little bit just to give you the opportunity to talk about the updates that you've integrated in this new third edition of your textbooks and your source books. And as well, if you could discuss the new quiz bank that's available to instructors as part of their resources in course planning. What new content can instructors expect in this third edition? And maybe you could talk a little also about how pairing the textbook with the source book will enhance student learning outcomes rather than each on their own.
Okay. Well, let me start with the student outcomes first. So one of my big student outcomes is students learn how to use evidence. That's really one of the big ones for me. And so in that regard, the source book is absolutely essential, right? That is, I mean, yes, students can, see how I use evidence in a class and then show on an exam that they have some command of that, of what I did and some understanding, and that's good. But for me at least, where the rubber hits the road is the student actually sitting down with the primary source the student hasn't read before, and ultimately on his or her own, right, coming to some conclusions. Now, I will have provided a framework that allows the students to ask good questions of that primary source, and one hopes to get good answers. But really, that's a student outcome that without the primary sources, it's really hard to do. So that would certainly be my view of the how all this helps along with student outcomes. Now, in terms of the new features, so in the textbook, I don't think there's a single subchapter. Right? If you've looked at the book before, the textbook actually has numbered subchapters, which, by the way, makes it really helpful for an instructor who doesn't want to assign a whole chapter at a time, whereas other textbooks may have subchapters, but they don't number them, so it's kind of harder to break it down in the syllabus. But I don't think there's a single subchapter that didn't get some revision. Now, some of the revisions are simply stylistic. That sentence really could be better, it could be more readable, and I made it more readable. But there are a lot of substantive revisions as well. So, for example, my discussion of the Neolithic Revolution includes newer work on the impact of that revolution on, for example, health and longevity in human societies. There's a lot more attention in Volume 1 on the West's relations with the non-Western world, right? In the Middle Ages, those of you who are medievalists will hear a little bit of the global Middle Ages here, as well as later on. Another new feature certainly is the fact that Volume 2, which goes to the present, had to get to the 2020s. And so populism, which I will say was anticipated in the second edition, gets really much more explicit discussion in the new edition. The Enlightenment and race and slavery get treatment that it did not really get, or those subjects did not really, like I should say, the intersection of those subjects did not really get the kind of treatment in the second edition that they get in the third. So there are a number of changes, and a lot of the changes in the source book, not all, but a lot of them reflect those changes. For example, we have some early 21st century populist reading and responses to it from the left in volume 2 of the text, volume 2 of the source book. But we also have just new sources in the source reader that are there because I think they're just going to be more effective, right? So, for example, the first 2 editions had a long selection from Hitler's Mein Kampf, and that was our fascism source. It's a useful source. I like teaching with it in some ways, but I will say students find it a bit of a slog, right? And in fact, German readers find it a bit of a slog. It is one. And so I've replaced it with several shorter sources. An excerpt from Mussolini's autobiography, so we have that biographical thread still there, but also by a fascist manifesto from Brazil, Plinio Salgado's Integralist Manifesto, a speech by Hitler, which frankly is more readable than Mein Kampf, and also a fascinating couple of really short sources paired on what was called the One Pot campaign in Germany under the Nazis, which was a campaign to basically encourage people not to eat so much on Sunday, so there would be food left over to donate to the nation and those in the nation who had less to eat. It's a kind of a brilliant illustration of how Nazism could work on the ground. So those 4 shorter sources replace Mein Kampf. And I think will be more effective for instructors who now actually have more to choose from when it comes to fascism, but also I think will be easier going than the old one. So attention to readability or just effectiveness has also been a criterion in making changes to the source book. And I think something like 1/3 of the source books have been in some way modified. Either because old sources went and new sources came in, or even old sources have been somewhat newly edited. Some of them a couple of selections trimmed down a bit, but there's been a lot of change. I hope people who loved teaching Mein Kampf will still stick with the reader, but I also hope that the new sources will be in fact more effective for instructors and their students.
Yeah, thank you for breaking that all down. I'm sure we have some participants that have used your books in the past, so it's helpful to know about what's changed and possibly for the better, be a little more accessible in ways. But also for those new to the book, it's helpful for them to know what to expect in both the textbook and the source book. So thank you. And I wanted to highlight, you were mentioning your unit subdivisions, and somebody in our chat really enjoys that and says that they work very well together, but also as a standalone argument. So that's great that you highlighted that and how that's not always the case with all other textbooks on Western Civ. So thank you for the comment. And on this topic on strategies, I wanted to talk a little bit about for instructors who are teaching a Western civilization course, perhaps for the first time, or if they're designing a course, perhaps considering your books as part of their course development. Could you talk a little bit about some best practices or techniques that you see as effective in helping students to develop this deeper appreciation for the subject rather than just being, intimidated, perhaps if it's a required course? What can instructors do to help foster this appreciation with the undergraduate student?
I think one thing that can be useful, and it's something I do not infrequently, I won't say I do it every time I teach the course, but I often do it, which is on the first day. Let me back up. Part of the goal of the course, at least when I teach it, is I want to help students explain the present, and so explain the world that has produced them, and so understand themselves better, right? That's the liberal, that is liberation in liberal education. And that is the goal here. And I want them to use that past, or understand the past to understand the present, while still understanding that the past is, as has been said, a foreign country. So that this is kind of a self-conscious wiggery for those out there who know this historical jargon. On the one hand, I do want to understand how students to understand how the present comes out of the past, but at the same time understanding that the past really was really different and alien to us, right? It's not just a straight line of something happened in the past and now we have it because we think just the way they did. So that's the goal. Well, it can help, I think, to have some discussion with students about what their present is, right? What is this present world that we're trying to explain? And so ask students, okay, what are some of the characteristics of the modern West, right? It actually can help to ask them, what is the West anyway, right? Many of them have no idea what that term means. I hate to say, at least my students often don't know what that term means when they come into the course. And so it's worth having a discussion of that, certainly. But then, okay, what are some of its characteristics? Okay, it doesn't have, or tends not to have, for example, theocratic monarchy, right? It tends to be religiously pluralistic, and while there are tensions about that, it's certainly that is the case, right? And so, all right, in this discussion, certainly I guide students to those aspects of the modern West that I in particular want to use the course to explain. Right, but it is useful to have this, if you like, consciousness-raising session, right, to help students think about the world that they're in, and so set them up to then explain this world using their understanding of the past that we're going to embark on in this semester. So that would be, I don't know if that's on a list of anybody's best practices, but it's certainly something I do, and I think it's useful.
That's great. It actually lends very nicely into kind of as we start to wrap up our discussion, and perhaps this will stimulate some questions with the audience. But I wanted to give a little bit more attention and time to talk about the significance of studying the history of Western civilization, particularly for the 21st century student. And you've already alluded to this a little, but I wanted to ask if you could talk about what historical themes in Volume 1 and Volume 2 feel especially relevant in today's global and political context. Particularly, I know that in your books you talk about, empire, and then leading more into industrialization in Volume 2 and global conflict. Can you speak a little bit more about what your textbooks are saying about what's going on in today's world, or how the students can relate to things that are going on today from learning about the past?
Sure. I think I'll go back to something I said about Volume 2 in particular. I think works well for that question. We live in a populist moment, right? And this populist moment is sometimes described as a nationalist populist moment, or national populism is the particular term that's used for the kind of populism that we're seeing today. Well, this is very much driven by the kind of desire for a sense of community that people have been experiencing in the West since really the later 18th century, driven by those atomizing forces that we've seen earlier. Globalism, and this is discussed in the book, globalization, I should say, is yet another atomizing force in a way, right? The complaint in many parts of the world is that globalization, which is sometimes seen as a synonym for Westernization in some places, undermines tradition. It undermines people's, and thereby undermines people's sense of connection with each other. It's atomizing. And of course, what is the cure for this, right? At least traditionally, the last couple of hundred years in the West. Well, one of those cures is nationalism. This idea that there's this national spirit that all people who share customs and language and so on partake in and bonds them together into a community. And I think the kind of national populism that we're seeing now is very much a manifestation of that. It's simply the latest iteration of that. Similarly, within countries, certainly within Western countries, there are complaints of balkanization, right? Complaints that people are simply defining themselves or should define themselves entirely in terms of things like race or sexual orientation or gender or one of these things. Again, what I think you can really see there is a response to atomization, right? When people are losing their sense of connection with others, they want to join groups. And indeed, one of the points I make with students is that the freshman year in college very often is a kind of microcosm of this, right? What happens in the first year of college? Students come from all over to a university. They've left their high schools where they all know their friends and all know their families and their neighbors, and they are thrown together. This is the definition of an atomized situation, right? They're all on their own. They're all student numbers. And of course, what do those students do their freshman year? Very many of them join groups, right? They join fraternities, they join sororities, they join the chess club, whatever it is, they join groups. Why? Because they want a sense of connection with others. They want a sense of community. And that experience is, in fact, been endemic to the West in general for the past couple hundred years. The big forces that are in the headlines, like nationalism, for example, are manifestations of that drive for a sense of community. So I do, and so certainly though pointing out to the freshman year in college and fraternities and sororities is a way of bringing home to students that yes, your experience this year is really the West's experience writ small for the past couple of hundred years. And it and what we've been talking about helps explain what you're going through in a way.
Thanks. That's all very well articulated, and I think it speaks to the kind of increasingly polarized environment that we are living in now, or the polarized academic and political climate. And I was wondering if you could kind of expand on this. You had mentioned that like it's a very atomized kind of society now, and coming from the past as well, it kind of shaped the way that it has as a result of history. And I'm wondering about some kind of controversial topics that may come up in a discussion of Western tradition in these kinds of courses, things like colonialism, Eurocentrism, or slavery, like topics that may be controversial and may make students maybe hesitant to speak up and discuss these kinds of ideas. Do you have any suggestions for instructors on how to handle these kinds of topics? And what do you think the future of teaching Western civilization is going to look like, for better or for worse, in this kind of climate that we're in?
All right. In terms of students feeling intimidated about saying stuff in class because they're walking on eggshells, right? I don't have any silver bullets for that, unfortunately. I wish I did, right? But I don't. What I have sometimes said to students is, while we do want to use the past to understand the present better, right now, we're going to bracket the present, right? We're going to worry about people in the past, right? So don't worry about modern repercussions or resonances. You can worry about that later, right? But right now, let's just deal with, say, slavery in the 18th century or something, right? And I know it has resonances and repercussions today, but we're not going to deal with that right now, right? So that may help. The other point that I do make to students is, and this sort of aligns with this, is we're going to avoid making moral judgments when dealing with the past, right? And we're going to do it because there's not, in my view, and I realize there will be those who disagree, in my view, there is, generally speaking, not much point to do it in the sense that moral judgment makes sense if you can reward or punish, right? Reward the people who behave well, punish the people who behave badly. But to quote myself in, I think, the first chapter of the book, of the first volume of the textbook, dead people are dead, right? We cannot punish the wicked who are dead. We cannot reward the good who are dead. They're dead, right? So let's just set aside the moral issues right now. Let's just try to understand this past, right? Now, with the warning always that this means trying to understand people who, in modern terms, were horrific, right? And so volume 1 of the first chapter in the textbook talks about, for example, what today would clearly be regarded as atrocities carried out by the Assyrians, right? And that doesn't mean we're wrong in thinking that these are atrocities, right? They, things like, defeating an army, killing 3,000 of the captured, and skinning the bodies and putting the skins up on the walls of the defeated city, right? Really, really awful behavior. It is true that we can understand how the Assyrians thought about this. They so identified with their patron god Ashur that resistance to the Assyrians was equated to resistance to Ashur, and therefore was a kind of a sin. And so these people deserved to be, slaughtered and skinned and so on. Fair enough. These still look like atrocities to us, right? And I think it's fair enough to acknowledge it, but also to explain to students or help students understand that in the end, there's nothing we can do to the Assyrians to punish them for this, right? And so saying again and again, it's an atrocity, that's true, but it doesn't get us very far in understanding the past and so understanding the present.
Very well said. And thank you for delving into those kinds of topics. I know they're not easy questions to answer, but I appreciate it, especially just in the nature of academia and talking about a wide variety of subjects in Western Civ. I'm sure that this is something a lot of instructors grapple with more and more. So thank you so much, Michael. It's been really lovely talking to you. It's very clear your passion for the richness of history and both your writing of the books and in your talk today. So thanks very much. Before we get to the question period, I just want to let everyone know that if you're interested in considering Volume 1 and/or Volume 2 of the Shaping of Western Civilization textbook or source reader for adoption in your teaching, just please reach out to your publisher's representative in your territory to receive an exam copy. You can find your representative on our new website, which is utppublishing.com. If you go under the contact page, you will see a tab that says sales, and then you will find your direct publisher's representative there. I'm one of them, and my colleague, Ashley, you will find there as well. We service instructors across Canada and the United States. So please reach out to us if you have any questions about Michael's book or any of his other books or any other courses you teach in history. We're also happy to share information on how you can bundle the textbook volumes together, depending on how your course is structured. If it's a full year and you would like to use Volume 1 and 2 a discounted bundle, we can provide you with a specific ISBN for ordering a shrink wrap bundle. We can also pair the textbook and the source reader together at a discounted price as well. So please, if you're interested in that, just reach out to us and we're happy to share that info and coordinate information with your campus bookstore. I think that's it. Thank you so much. I'm going to hand this over to Natalie now to moderate our Q&A.
So thank you both for that conversation. I could listen to Michael talk about history and primary sources and the importance of evidence for hours. I'm sure this was very helpful to instructors who are thinking about teaching Western Civ. I did want to just pick up on something that, Michael, you said about the big ideas of Volume 1 and Volume 2, theocracy and its ending, and then community. I think that that framing makes these books very different to the competition, to the competing books, that there are big ideas that students can kind of follow through and wade through the material. We do have one question in the chat from Rebecca Deuce. Given the growing popularity and effectiveness of role play as a teaching tool, which sources or sections would you recommend as prime material for potential simulations?
Oh, this whoever Rebecca Deuce is her name.
Yes.
Rebecca Deuce, you have just made me feel like a simple country historian. I've never role played or had students role play, so it's not a question I've thought about that much or any at all. But let me think. I would think that one a source that would might lend itself to this or help students along in doing this might be something like the Res Gestae, or as the title is translated in Volume 1 of the source book, the Deeds of the Divine Augustus, where Augustus lays out his career and what he has done and why he should be admired, etc., without apparently bragging. And I think that could conceivably, if a student wanted to say role play Augustus, and maybe another student role play one of Augustus's critics or opponents, I think the Deeds of the Divine Augustus might lend itself nicely to that. Although I will say that with the caveat that since I've never had students role play, I'm not drawing on a great wealth of experience in having students do that.
Mark Sell's comment was, "Yikes! Don't reenact the Assyrian atrocities."
Okay, please don't do that. That should not be done at home.
No,
your expert supervision.
When I was a sales rep back in the day, and I had to sell, and I was selling this, one of the questions we often got was, "Can this be used in a World Civ course?" What's your answer to that?
Okay, my answer is yes, depending on the World Civ course. So I have used the volumes in a world history. I think that probably the reader lends itself better to that now than it did, because I've brought in some further non-Western sources, or sources on the interaction of the West and the non-Western world. And actually, there's more of that discussion in Volume 1 of the textbook as well. Volume 2 of the textbook always was kind of global. And here I would say, and so the short answer is yes.
Okay.
I think it can be done.
Okay. Matthew Marsh is just typing. Elizabeth, if you could just put your email into the chat for people who require further information, that would be terrific.
Thanks, will do now.
Okay, so while Professor Marsh is typing, I'll just ask my last question. So you talked a lot about evidence as being a key or a core skill from this book. What other skills do you think that an instructor could say that your books will impart to them that help them sort of, well, grapple with the past for sure, but maybe even meet the current moment?
Okay. Well, I think one may be um, a certain distancing from the current moment, right? It has been said that the study of history provides perspective on the present. Well, I've actually kind of addressed that. But of course, perspective also means, in a sense, a certain distance from the present, a sort of sense that the present is not the only kind of world that can exist, right? There have been other kinds of worlds that have existed. And I think, given the passions of our present moment, I think it is arguable that a certain distance and a certain coolness would be helpful, both for individuals trying to navigate the world they're in, but also for the world itself, honestly. So I think that would be another thing to gain. I think another intellectual habit that students, I think, could gain from the textbook and thinking about it carefully is to see connections, connections across time in particular, while understanding that times change. One of the characteristics of the book, I think, that does honestly make it different from other books, which is why I wrote it, is that Western Civ textbooks have a tendency to be compartmentalized, right? There's a tendency for different chapters or different sections often to be written by different people, right? Often teams of historians write these things, which obviously offers some advantages, especially for the writers, but on the other hand, tends to make the books choppy and tends to discourage students from drawing a connection between, say, ancient Rome on the one hand and the 18th century Enlightenment on the other, right? And so I think, maybe I'm sure I'm sure there are better minds out there that could have written these books, right? But at least you've got one mind writing these books, and so that one mind is thinking about, does have an eye on, say, ancient Rome when writing the section on the Enlightenment and vice versa, right? And so I think that makes for greater coherence. That's a better experience for students, but it also means simply students are encouraged more to see connections across large quantities of time.
Yeah, that's it. That's an interesting point. Matthew Marsh wrote, as someone who uses the textbook in a world history context, the book lends itself greatly to this type of class. The book allows the instructor to use the text as an anchor while bringing in other materials from the Islamic and Sinic worlds, as well as the pre-colonial American contexts. So, right, using it as the anchor, and then broadening out.
And I think that instructor might be cheered then by the fact that the reader, for example, has now more selections from the Islamic world, for example,
right,
than the second or first edition did.
So I think that's all I'm seeing in the chat. So thank you so much again, Michael. It's just a treat to listen to you talk about this subject. And to Elizabeth, the emails of our publisher representatives are now in the chat. Please be in touch with us, of course, if you have any questions. And thank you for all meeting with us today.
Okay, thank you very much. I very much enjoyed it. And by the way, I'm always happy to chat with anybody who drops me a line about teaching Western Civ.
Wonderful.
Or world history.
Wonderful. And this, as we said in the beginning, this has been recorded. So for others who want to see it, we will have it available.
Great.
Thank you again. Thank you, everybody. Have a good rest of the day.
All right. Bye-bye.